people have to believe that there's going to be a better life for them and for their children if they're going to commit their energy to learning something that is as difficult to learn as reading and writing if you've never done it before. So this was really the whole idea behind it, was that by bringing the message of the revolution and the good word about the revolution, because it was a good word, to people, that it would excite them to learn. And this is really what happened. And I saw this with my own eyes.
Vuestra planta, nuestra raíz.
No se ponga nervioso si usted sabe leer.
Nuestra raíz, el maíz, es de órgano en casi todo el...
I think the most immediate impact was the reduction of the illiteracy rate from 52% before the revolution to 12%, I think is what the figure is after the campaign. That's probably been reduced now since there's been an ongoing campaign since the first 5 months ended. So 500,000 people know how to read and write, at least on a basic level, have taken that first step than did before. That's a marvelous thing in and of itself.
Es un grano monocotiledonio.
En cambio, la planta del frijol está formada por dos partes y por eso se le da el nombre de dicotiledonio. Por lo general, esta planta es anual. Es decir, na 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 na.
Convirtiendo la oscura en claridad, Josefana va, por la costa va, con un sol en su cartilla de enseñar. Josefana va, por la costa va, comandante de una escuadra cultural, replicando su lección va por Huaspán. Selva adentro su brigada penetró, socolando de ignorancia la región. Ana, ana, na, na, na. Ana, na, 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 na. Josefana va por la costa va. Ana.
One of the sentences is revolution is action. And the next one is the nation is in motion. Revolution is action. It means a lot for us.
People generally think of the United States of America as a developed nation in which nearly all adults can read and write. Yet in reality, some 25 million adults in the United States are completely illiterate, while an additional 35 million cannot read or write well enough to understand want ads or fill out job applications. All told, some 60 million American adults are incapable of functioning effectively in our increasingly complicated society. Thomas Jefferson once observed, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be." Indeed, this remarkable rate of illiteracy in one of the world's most advanced industrial democracies must be viewed as an ominous threat to democracy itself and to the continued advancement of all humankind.
I mean, in the United States, there's a high degree of functional literacy, and there's a tremendous amount of money available, public programs, federal programs, state programs, church programs, private programs. I think that if one compared the resources, material resources, financing, and even perhaps the human resources available in a country like the United States to be able to deal with that problem of functional literacy, it would seem that that could be dealt with in 2 months, in a country like the United States. Why isn't it possible? Why isn't it done? Why doesn't it happen? Why does it happen in a country like Nicaragua that's so extraordinarily poor, so excruciatingly poor, where there is no funding, where there are no resources, where a country had to turn itself upside down, begging, literally begging funds from all over the world, from church groups, from sympathetic governments, from solidarity committees.
As many as 1 billion adults in today's world are illiterate. They live in developed and underdeveloped countries alike. Yet it's in the underdeveloped world where the most serious efforts are being made to eradicate illiteracy. Here in the poorer nations, universal literacy is seen increasingly as a prerequisite for national development.
Underdevelopment also has a cultural side, as it has a social side and an economic side. The cultural side of underdevelopment was expressed in the extraordinary backwardness and ignorance of our people, above all in those sectors connected with agricultural production, the peasant sectors, and also the workers, the urban workers in general. Indeed, the literacy crusade meant a first great step in overcoming that cultural underdevelopment in which our people found themselves.
And when we are trying to solve the problem of illiteracy in Nicaragua, we are trying to solve at the same time all the problem of poverty in the country, housing, health, and to try to advance in all senses with the people to conquer a new standard of life. And part of this new standard of life is the ability to read, the ability to write, to understand the culture, to understand the techniques, the technology, and through this way to solve the problem of development. Because without culture, without education, we know that we can't be able to solve the problem of the developing of Nicaragua.
If the purpose of the revolution is to develop the country economically, to develop it socially, to promote the integral development of the individual citizen, then it had to begin with a gigantic project like the Literacy Crusade that would permit the vast majority of Nicaragua's illiterates to obtain an elementary education.
Nicaragua is an example of an underdeveloped nation that has made the eradication of illiteracy a priority of national development. This documentary will examine the reasons for that decision and how Nicaraguans mobilized to carry it out.
One of the things that maybe even made it easier for me as a North American to take part in the literacy campaign, maybe even easier than somebody from Colombia or Costa Rica or Spain, was that I came from a country that was that played a very central role in the whole history of Nicaragua. I mean, the dictatorship that they had succeeded in overthrowing, the Somoza dictatorship, was there in the first place because of what the government of my country had done, because the U.S. government put the Somoza dictatorship there.
There were 50,000 victims of the revolution within the last few years, and many of them innocent women and children killed by bombings of their own towns, and not even Hitler bombed his own cities in Germany, you know.
And I think that it's significant that only in countries where you have a grassroots revolution or revolutionary process designed and fought and sacrificed for by people, by the majority of the people who've risked everything, including their lives, to overthrow powers that have controlled and submitted and subverted them. When you have a situation like that where people have risked everything, a situation like Nicaragua where it's cost 50,000 lives, that's where you begin to see people taking their lives in their hands and designing programs like the literacy program here.
During the long decades of Somoza dictatorship, education was a jealously guarded privilege of the few. The Somozas showed little interest in and provided only token resources for public schooling. By denying education to a majority of Nicaraguans, the dictatorship fostered passivity among the general populace. An illiterate or poorly educated population, they reasoned, was a docile population that would not challenge the privileged few.
We are speaking of the situation in 1963, when I became Minister of Education. That is, prior to the Managua earthquake. You might suppose that the best schools would be those located closest to the seat of government. In Managua, however, that was not the case. For public primary schools, those paid for by the state were actually private residences whose owners had rented them to the government for use as schools. Since there wasn't enough room for the children inside, they used makeshift classrooms separated by thin partitions in the exterior corridors. Whenever a child raised his voice, he would be heard in the adjoining classroom. Classes were constantly interrupted by the children's shouts and loud voices. In the morning, the children would have class on one side of the building, and in the afternoon on the other side, because the sun forced them to move. That was when they actually had a house available to them, one with a brick floor. But there were also cases, especially in the poor outlying neighborhoods, where the floors were of dirt and the children had no desks. Some children would have to sit on the ground. Others would bring a little chair from home and take it with them after school. This was because the government lacked the resources to provide school children with chairs and desks. That's the way things were. And we're talking about Managua. If we talk about the countryside, the situation was frequently worse, because very often there was not even a house, just a tree. Classes were held under a tree. That shows you the dedication of some teachers, who even in such extreme conditions were willing to teach. The poverty of our country made this necessary.
One of the most perceptive observers of Nicaragua's revolutionary process, American expatriate poetess Margaret Randall, notes the close connection between illiteracy and political domination, domestic as well as foreign.
In all the cases of domination, ignorance is one of the most important tools that a dominating power has. You can't allow a people who you control to become too aware of the forces that are controlling their lives. It's clear that in all cases of power throughout history, it's been very important for the power to be to keep people in a situation of dependency. Ignorance is, I think, one of the prime elements in a situation of dependency.
It benefited the Somoza dictatorship that people were illiterate. It was easier for Somoza and the people around him to exploit the workers and the peasants if they didn't know how to read and write. It became harder for the people to understand what the source of their oppression was by not knowing how to read and write. It became more difficult for the people to organize against that oppression because they didn't know how to read and write, and the sources of the means of communication and so on went there. So it wasn't just an accident that the Somoza dictatorship never bothered to invest money and resources into education.
We want our people to participate. With the triumph of the revolution, we wanted them to begin a process of democratization. And the first step was to begin to learn to read and write so that they could discover their own dignity, their past, the power they held in their own hands to shape their future. We also wanted them to acquire new technical skills so they could produce more and improve their standard of living. We stressed, therefore, that this was a political act and a revolutionary act. The revolutionary part was not in the words we had chosen for them to begin to learn to read. What was really revolutionary was that the whole populace of our country should begin to learn to read and write. That was the most revolutionary part of all.
In underdevelopment, one generally finds a situation where certain social sectors enjoy all the national wealth, while the great majority of people are isolated from that wealth. Generally, these privileged sectors are the people who control the country's foreign trade, its agricultural exports, and they are also the ones who benefit from the educational system, those who have the best educational opportunities. And the majority of people whose unskilled labor helps generate the national wealth are also the ones who have no educational opportunities at all. It has sometimes been stated that a population's illiteracy engenders its underdevelopment, when actually illiteracy is itself the result of underdevelopment, of unjust social structures, badly distributed wealth, and the isolation of major sectors of society from educational opportunities.
On August 2nd, 1979, barely 2 weeks after the Somoza dictatorship was overthrown by a popular insurrection, the newly formed Government of National Reconstruction called for a national mobilization to eradicate illiteracy. In so doing, it was implementing a key component of the revolutionary program of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, which had led the arduous struggle against the dictatorship. What over the next 6 months would become a veritable army of 80,000 trained literacy teachers and 100,000 support personnel grew from an initial staff of 7, only 2 of whom were experienced educators.
Respecto a las etapas de la alfabetización, tenemos que decir que a los 15 días,
15 days after the triumph of the revolution, when there was still sporadic fighting here in Managua, when it was still dangerous to go out at night, when there were still burning embers from the hot war, I was given orders to commence the literacy campaign. Starting in August 1979 then, we began to organize a staff and to plan. We began an effort that would last until the 24th of March, 1980. Which is when the thousands of students headed off to the mountains. That was the beginning of the National Literacy Crusade. Everything up to that point had been in preparation for the start.
Nicaragua's National Literacy Crusade had 7 specific objectives, all of which together aimed at fundamentally changing Nicaraguan society by directly involving, for the first time in Nicaraguan history, the overwhelming majority of Nicaraguans in the shaping of their own lives. These goals were to teach the mechanics of reading and writing, and in the process, to raise citizens' awareness of themselves, their rights, and their human potential, to lay the bases for continuing universal adult education, to promote women's and youth associations, trade unions, rural workers' associations, neighborhood self-help groups, and other mass organizations, to raise national health levels, to inventory the country's natural, cultural, and economic resources, and finally, to initiate a sweeping process of national integration.
Most of them had never gone to school, had never read a book because they didn't know how to read. They'd all heard about Sandino. They all knew who Carlos Fonseca Amador was. But there were a lot of things that just simple, basic facts of history that, that they didn't know.
Voy a subir los huevos para que salgan también. Ingrid tomando. Gracias, gracias. Ya no hay. Ya no hay, dice, ya no van a salir. Macho va a salir.
Esas cosas típicas, eso es lo que les gusta a ellos. Sí, los típicos.
There's always that fear that once people know how to read and know how to write, they're going to find out the truth.
So goals were set that made the National Literacy Crusade not only an effort to raise people's awareness by teaching them to read and write, with all that entails pedagogically and politically, but an exceedingly broad and exceedingly rich undertaking that had cultural, historical, and health aspects, one that had scientific, biological, even botanical aspects, where an inventory was made of the country's flora and of plants that could be used for medicinal purposes. Likewise, an investigation was made of new archaeological sites in the country. So our goal was not one single goal, rather that it was a complex, very rich goal. The Literacy Crusade, therefore, was one of the most important events after the triumph of the revolution.
Nicaragua's National Literacy Crusade was an all-embracing endeavor, a massive effort of national self-discovery. It sought successfully to provide ordinary citizens with the ability to see themselves for the first time in their own world. It allowed them to discover that world and to discover the forces that had shaped it. The key to designing Nicaragua's Literacy Crusade was the concept of conscientization, the raising of a person's consciousness, of one's awareness of who he or she is in a particular society at a particular time, and why. Conscientizing in the process of teaching people to read and to write. During the latter months of 1979, resources were marshaled and planning went forward under the direction of Father Fernando Cardenal, a Jesuit priest and one of several religious personages active in the new government of national reconstruction. Drawing on the theories and advice of Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Freire, as well as the literacy experiences of Cuba, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and other third world countries, Cardenal and his hastily assembled staff undertook the imposing preparatory tasks essential to a successful implementation of a nationwide campaign. The designing and carrying out of a preliminary literacy census, the elaboration of teaching materials, the development of uniform instructional techniques, the organization of a logistical and administrative support structure capable of sustaining 80,000 literacy teachers in difficult circumstances for a period of 5 months, and the procurement of supplies, equipment, and material resources amounting to millions of hard-to-find dollars. In the months prior to the crusade, Nicaragua issued a plea for material assistance to the international community. Public and private bodies in over 35 countries responded with goods and materials valued at more than $12 million. The largest contributions came from the Federal Republic of Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, Holland, and England, while in the Americas, substantial aid arrived from Colombia, Peru, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Cuba, as well as from a variety of donors in Canada and the United States. In Nicaragua itself, communities held fund drives. State and private employees donated entire days' salaries to the literacy crusade. Dances, songfests, concerts, and poetry readings were organized to raise funds. And the Nicaraguan government issued patriotic literacy bonds to generate additional monies. 1980 was proclaimed the Year of Literacy.
Well, this is the Cuaderno de Educación Sandinista. This is the teacher's manual that each brigadista used to guide him or herself through the teaching, through the classes. There were a total of 23 lessons in the campaign, and each lesson was preceded by a certain subject concerning the revolution. For example, the first class, the class was based on the theme of Sandino. It's titled Sandino, Guía de la Revolución, Sandino, Guide of the Revolution, and we talked about who Sandino was, what he had done, and so on. Later on in the course, on Lesson 10, La Reforma Agraria, recupera la producción de la tierra para el pueblo, the agrarian reform, and we had discussion about the agrarian reform, what it meant in our the particular area that we were in, and so on. A chapter on the mass organizations. The final chapter is on internationalism and the importance of creating fraternal bonds between people of different countries, including people of the United States. And it says this here in this book. It talks about the difference between the people of the United States and the government, and how it's always important to distinguish between the two. And it says here that people of the United States are our friends.
The teaching strategy employed in Nicaragua's National Literacy Crusade had 3 basic components: generative words, thematic pictures, and dialogue, or group discussion. Generative words, as Paulo Freire called them, were words drawn from the daily experience of Nicaraguans, words that had particular significance for those who were learning to read and write, and that evoked in them a shared sense of meaning. These words provided the basic sounds and syllables, the building blocks of the Spanish language. The thematic pictures in the literacy workbooks serve to visualize the abstract meaning of the generative words. These pictures were used to stimulate discussion around the larger social meaning of those words, thereby establishing vital links between the written symbols of language and the daily experience of the learner. In the process, a process of conscientization, the previously illiterate learner gradually acquires the tools to comprehend the world around him, and thus to define that world for himself. He gains control of his own life.
It's true that the literacy campaign was a totally political event. Just the fact of teaching people how to read and write when over 50% of the people don't know how is a political act. And it's a political act because there are political reasons why 50% of the people don't know how to read and write.
¿Por qué es importante el maíz en nuestra alimentación?
Porque es el grano que se utiliza para los países del mundo.
We consider education as a political fact and as a political instrument of development to transform reality in our country, to transform persons in our country. And the only way to have a change in the quality of education in Nicaragua was to have first a revolution.
On March 23, 1980, Nicaragua declared a war of cultural liberation against illiteracy. The National Literacy Crusade was designated the second battle, the first having been the protracted armed struggle against the Somoza dictatorship. Indeed, ignorance was seen as part of the same enemy, more tenacious, more insidious than Somoza, more difficult to defeat. For it had been the very underpinning of the Somoza tyranny. Accordingly, the Literacy Crusade was conceived as a continuation of the armed struggle. The country was divided into 6 literacy fronts corresponding to the former military fronts of the FSLN. Literacy teachers were called brigadistas, 80,000 strong. They formed the ranks of the People's Literacy Army, which, organized into brigades, columns, and squads, carried the battle to the most remote confines of the country.
I guess maybe I had over-romanticized, you know, what was waiting for me in the countryside. I never realized that life in the countryside would be as difficult as it really turned out to be, and I didn't really have a clear conception of what poverty really was in Central America. I was absolutely shocked when I got there, and really the whole 4 months that we spent in the mountain was sort of one continuous shock for all of us. We saw children die of hunger and people living in a real sad state.
In the first place, the crusade was a brutal encounter with reality. Most of the brigadistas had never in their lives spent more than a week away from the comforts of their own homes. And it was a brutal shock to have to confront a total lack of all those comforts, a total lack of the minimum conditions for a human being, of medicine, of the most basic elements of modern life.
If you've lived in the city your whole life and you're used to, you know, things that we take for granted like running water and electricity and a floor under your feet instead of dirt and so on, it's hard to walk into conditions where none of those things are available. And not only that, but it's not just a lack of you know, modern conveniences, but also a lack of the most basic things like healthy water to drink, enough food to eat, and so on. In the village that I was in, we saw, my squadron saw 4 children die of the effects of malnutrition. And as a matter of fact, one of those kids died in my arms as I was trying to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I remember that.
As in all wars, brigadistas sacrificed and died during the 5-month campaign. 9 young literacy teachers were murdered by renegade Somoza supporters. 49 others perished as a result of accident or illness.
Nosotros estuvimos pensando también como revolucionarios, como políticos revolucionarios.
When we developed the literacy lessons, we were also thinking like revolutionaries, like revolutionary politicians. But I think that if you've had a chance to read through the literacy workbooks, you will realize that there is no manipulation there of people's ignorance in order to imbue them with a particular current of thought. Logically, we made an elementary effort to articulate for the people the history of their own struggle and to present it to them in the workbooks. The problem is that in our country, and even more, I think, outside the country, there are those who don't want Nicaraguans to hold the values of Sandino, who don't want them to know the history of our struggle against the dictatorship. These are the people who feel that by including some of the history of Sandinismo in the literacy lessons, we are guilty of political manipulation.
A century ago, one of the political forefathers of the Nicaraguan right, Joaquin Zavala, said that the worker and the peasant should not be taught to read. Give the people your hand, he said, and they'll tear out your eyes. The common people were not to be taught, because then they would want to rule. And that could never be.
Yeah, I remember before we left for the countryside, the first 3 weeks I was in Managua, there was a big campaign that was being carried out by the opposition parties, and basically the opposition parties were political organizations that represented what in Nicaragua is known as the burguesia, or in other words, the owners of the factories and the big landowners, or the people that had benefited from the system under Somoza. And they were going on this big campaign claiming that the literacy crusade was really nothing more than an attempt to brainwash the peasantry with Marxist ideology.
Following the revolution, after Alfonso Robelo had resigned from the government of national reconstruction, while the crusade was still going on, there was a series of attacks on the National Literacy Crusade. While Giorgino Andrade was being murdered in Chinandega, while Noel Gadea was being murdered in Rio Coco, while Juana Maria Cruz was being murdered in Huihuili, Robelo and company, the so-called democratic parties, were saying that the literacy crusade was brainwashing. When brigadistas were giving their lives to teach the people to read, these groups of the right, the ones who are opposed to the revolution, were saying that to teach the people to read was to brainwash them, that it was in fact a crime. Indeed, there's a great similarity between the political views of today's right in Nicaragua and those of the Nicaraguan right 150 years ago.
See, the problem in Nicaragua was that for 50 years, there had been brainwashing going on. But the problem was that the brainwashing came from a dictatorship that represented a very small minority of the population and which acquired tremendous wealth through brutally exploiting the majority of the people. And the brainwashing that went on were these ideas about the evils of communism and how anybody that raised their voice to protest those injustices really had other intentions in mind and were trying to bring communism to Nicaragua and so forth. And there were all these misconceptions about what communism or Marxism or socialism were all about. Many peasants, for example, after the revolution thought that religion was going to be abolished, that their land was going to be taken away, and so on. These were all ideas that were propagated by the Somoza dictatorship.
I think around at least 10 years ago, we became more and more involved in our own efforts towards consciousness raising or concientización. We feel that this is something that's very important because the campesinos in the department of Zelaya, at least 10 years ago and 12 years ago, suffered from a good deal of fatalism. Many of them tended to feel that God made some people rich and some people poor, some people with good luck and some people with bad luck, and God made them poor and that they really shouldn't try to rebel against their destiny and they should accept this from the hand of God, and it's just their bad luck, you know, and just do the best. After all, Christ was poor too, and he was born in a stable, and we should learn from him, and things like that. Well, this used to really drive us up the wall, you know, and so this is not something that you attack with a frontal offensive, you know. This is something that you have to really work on, and so we felt that an effort towards consciousness raising, of helping them to realize their dignity as human beings and as Christians, that their ability to form their own destiny, at least to some extent, especially by working together, was something very important and really an essential part of our whole evangelization program. So we began efforts towards conscientization in Pablo Freire style about 10 years ago or so. And we developed a number of different programs on this and courses for our lay pastors that they in turn would return and present to their people. We have at the present time about 1,700 lay pastors in the Department of Zelaya attending the people, and they have really had a tremendous influence on the people. After these courses, they would go back and present them to the people back home.
Marchemos compañeros, vamos ya, que nuestra lucha no termina ahí. Tenemos por delante algo más, es el deber de enseñar a los demás.
Pablo Freire insists, and I agree with him, that there is no real conscientization unless the people are moved to actually make a political commitment, a commitment to really work together to improve their own lives, to try to do what they can to forge their own destinies.
It's the whole question of how people learn also. It would have been totally impossible for 500,000 people, 500,000 people, to learn how to read and write in 5 months if those people had not believed that a better future was in store for them.
Porque fue tan importante, porque la importancia que nosotros no
The
teníamos,
importance that was denied us, we have now achieved. We didn't know how to read, and now we've learned. We were insensitive, and now we're not. Now, when someone is hurting, we help him. Not with money, but at least with our hands or moral support. We weren't like that before.
Before, I was a machetero. I worked with a machete clearing fields. But today, now that I've half learned to read and have learned a few things, I'm a foreman. So my work has changed. Seeing all this, seeing the change in my life, what interests me is to continue learning, so as to improve my situation still more.
Before, when I went shopping, I had to leave my thumbprint, but not now. Now I sign my own name. That really pleases me.
La mujer alfabetizada. Además de tener, digamos, ese despertar que tuvo el
Besides experiencing that same awakening that everyone who learned to read and write experienced, women also had the opportunity to go to the CEPs, the popular education collectives of continuing adult education. Women continued to learn. They continued to learn and to become aware of more things. Moreover, the revolution taught them that women had been oppressed too, and that an essential part of the revolution is the complete liberation of women, not libertinism, not licentiousness, not freedom in an abstract, unrestricted sense, but the integral liberation of women as human beings who've been oppressed and exploited in particular ways.
Bueno, la visión es que hoy en día no quedarán brutos como
Today, our children no longer need be brutes all their lives like before, because education is grandeur. He who studies is great, and he who doesn't is little. And that's what we believe. It's the greatness that we've never had until now. And for that, we are grateful to our government, because that's what our government seeks, that we should learn and at the same time teach. That's our career now, studying and teaching. Because that person who before didn't know anything today says, "Sure, you bet, I'm going to study," because we make him see how important it is to study, and how before we didn't bother because nobody cared about us. We make him see that today we have a weapon. We say to him, "Let's help ourselves so that we may be helped." It's a great thing.
The other thing that was real important, and which the revolutionary government foresaw, was the bridging of the gap between countryside and city, which is something that Somosismo had always attempted to maintain, and which was something that was created by the system itself. The intense exploitation of the campesinos created this gap between countryside and city, and there was never any real communication among the two areas of the country. The people in the city didn't really know or really have a real grasp as to how people in the countryside lived and how they suffered, or even what they did, how much they really contributed to the well-being of the country as a whole. When you see people living in the conditions that the Nicaraguan peasantry lived in and was living in then, it's very easy to understand why people would rebel against that and rise up and try to bring to power a government that would really represent their interests. So just being in that situation made us realize what this revolution was all about.
As the 5 months passed, villages, communities, neighborhoods, and workplaces all across the country were declared territory-free of illiteracy, and the red and black victory flag was raised in triumph. It had been dry and dusty when the Literacy Army first set out. Now, 5 months later, Nicaragua was moist and green from the seasonal rains, and some would say, from tears of joy. Amassed in Managua's 19th of July Square, the returning brigadistas first learned the achievements of their extraordinary effort.
Que después de 5 meses de ardua lucha en campos, montañas y ciudades, hemos logrado enseñar a leer y escribir a 406.056 nicaragüenses, reduciendo la tasa de analfabetismo de un 50.35% a un 12.96%.
What happened after the campaign is you had these tens of thousands of young people who experienced firsthand what poverty really is and had seen firsthand what the U.S. government and the Somoza dictatorship had done to the campesinos. And those tens of thousands of young people came back, went back to the cities as hardened defenders and supporters of the Nicaraguan Revolution, and personally committed to continue working for the revolution and for the well-being of the poor.
Me decía a mí un científico norteamericano que
I was told by a North American expert that after all wars, above all such a bloody war as ours, A country is left with psychological scars that can show themselves for years afterward. But that here in Nicaragua, he had found great psychological health. And he told me that he thought that in Nicaragua, the reason for this was that immediately after the triumph of the revolution came the literacy crusade. At the very moment when perhaps in another revolution, people would have been thinking of revenge, of executing their enemies, and giving rein to all those sentiments that can lead to psychological problems. Here there was a great campaign, a project of love. All those sentiments that could have been negative were channeled into a positive project, a project of love. The entire nation closed ranks to eradicate illiteracy. It was a shared goal of all our people. And that's why, according to that North American expert, the psychological scars were minimal, despite the exceedingly difficult war our people had suffered.
And maybe more than anything else, it's a tremendous, I think, inspiration for the whole world. And I don't think that we've seen the end of what the impact of this literacy campaign is going to be on inspiring other people around the world who are also struggling against the same things that the Nicaraguans struggled against.
The tasks ahead constitute a great challenge, for we must assure that the fruits of this crusade are not lost, because the newly literate can forget what they've learned as quickly as they learned it.
Por eso nosotros, y esto significa un caso excepcional.
Nicaragua is an exceptional case in this regard. Even before the crusade ended, we had organized the follow-up stage. In the final 2 weeks of the literacy crusade, literacy units were transformed into adult education units. Before the literacy teachers left the countryside, we had created the Popular Education Collective, the CEP, or CEP. And these collectives made it possible for us to implement in a short period of time the follow-up adult education program. We also created the Vice Ministry of Adult Education, whose task is to promote the continuing education of the newly literate.
Besides the alphabetization of the literacy program in Spanish, they also had the following year a literacy program in languages, Miskito, Sumu, and English. And the number of English speakers is smaller than the number of Miskito speakers. And also the English-speaking people are concentrated much more in the cities, where they have not only able to read and write, but they have or even secondary educational facilities.
This revolution is trying to do something differently. The teaching to read and write, for example, was carried out in Miskito. That is, the Miskitos were taught to read and write by Miskito teachers in their own language. Now, this wasn't an easy task because before this you had very few Miskito teachers. So you had to train Miskito teachers to go and train Miskito people to read and write. You had the same thing with the Sumu. The teaching, the alphabetization was carried out in Sumu by the Sumu people. And it wasn't an easy thing. You had to prepare the materials, the teaching materials. You had to prepare the people. And you had to, the logistical situation of getting into these very remote communities was not an easy thing. This government, for example, has also, it's now a law of the country that each child shall be taught in his native language until the 4th grade. That is, the Miskito child will be taught in Miskito until the 4th grade. The child whose native language is English will be taught in English until the 4th grade. The child whose native language is Sumu will be taught in Sumu until the 4th grade. Now, simultaneously with this teaching of the first grades of the elementary school in English, the child will be taught Spanish as a second language. Then hopefully, after the 4th grade, he'll be able to have most of his subject matters taught in Spanish.
Nicaragua's national literacy crusade had far-reaching consequences beyond its immediate objective of teaching people to read and write. It profoundly altered Nicaraguan society, setting in motion deep, irreversible currents of social and political change. And those same currents, by their example, would reach well beyond Nicaragua's national boundaries.
It's given me hope, that a feeling of certainty that it is possible to change society for the better. That it's not necessarily it's a given, or it's not a necessary thing that people have to starve to death or suffer all these different diseases or live in poverty. That it's not a given that you know, just regular people like you and me can't really play an active and a meaningful role in how the government is run or how society is organized. Those things can be done, and I saw that with my own eyes in Nicaragua. It just gave me confidence that a better world is possible, that, and that a better world is being made.
Na 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 na. Na 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 na. Na 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 na. Na 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 na. Convirtiendo la oscuridad en claridad, Josefana va por la costa va, con un sol en su cartilla de enseñar. Josefana va, por la costa va, comandante de una escuadra cultural, repicando su lección va por Huaspán. Selva dentro su brigada penetró, socolando de ignorancia la región. Ana, Ana, na, na, na. Ana, na, 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 na. Josefana va por la costa va. Ana, Ana, na, na, na. Ana, na, 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 na. Convirtiendo la oscura en claridad, Josefana va por la costa va. Se va con un sol en su cartilla de enseñar. Josefana va, por la costa va, muy temprano de mañana va a sembrar la semilla de aprender y de enseñar. En Cayuco o en Pipante Río bajando, con sus ojos de futuro va cantando. Ana, 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 na, na, na. Ana, na, 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 na. Ana. Navidad. José Panamá, por la costa va, se va.